Right guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. We are barely a week away from the teams arriving in Melbourne for the first Grand Prix of the 2025 season, and what a season it promises to be. But Ferrari's test was rather unconvincing in Bahrain. Other teams, though, believe Ferrari may have been hiding something. They do not think that Ferrari's performance on track was indicative of how good their car is actually going to be for the upcoming season. Some call this sandbagging, but is that actually what's going on? Because Hamilton and Leclerc are reportedly strapped to the simulator in Maranello right now to do all the debriefing work before they get into the season. Very much interested your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into. We're going to start here. The FIA tweeted this out today. How many cars can you count? If I click on this image, actually the image does turn up, but if I click on the tweet has been deleted. But I can still just about see it through the quote tweet here, and well, I don't know what the FIA were implying. Maybe that Cadillac is, of course, arriving soon to the grid. Kind of confusing, because everyone knows there's going to be an 11th team on the grid next year in 2026, but it's actually not been made like fully official by the FIA, so it's kind of confusing for now, but I think that's only a matter of time. This an update as well. We have the tyre compounds for Jeddah. It's been an interesting Grand Prix for multiple reasons over the last few years. They're going to make them a step softer. There has also been talk from George Russell during practice. He doesn't think this year's tyres are very good. Now, to be fair, last year Russell was the biggest opponent, I guess, to Pirelli and their tyre compounds. He wasn't a happy man about the way that he felt like the tyres were working with that Mercedes, and maybe it wasn't just the Mercedes' fault. He felt like you put on one set of mediums, you get this performance, you put on another set of mediums, you get a different set of performance. But we are going to go a step softer. I will always support this. Like every Grand Prix that goes a step softer in tyre compounds is fine by me, because it increases the likelihood of a two-stop race, which usually makes things slightly more exciting. There was a bit of drama yesterday as well. So Hamilton's of course gone to Ferrari now, and there's been some leaked comments and quotes coming out of Drive to Survive ahead of the season launch in a few days' time. And well, it turns out that Toto Wolff made some comments on Hamilton and Verstappen. Despite Verstappen picking fights with Hamilton and current driver George Russell, Wolff is in no doubt that adding Verstappen to the ranks would improve his lineup. He said, "I haven't talked to him because I promised Lewis not to talk to him, but I will have the conversation now." That was said in Drive to Survive, and it caused a lot of talking point, right? Because it's like, oh, Hamilton, scared of fighting Verstappen or whatever. Like, I don't really think that's the crux of the matter. I think that Verstappen would feel the same way at Red Bull to some degree, because if you're going to bring in a multiple-time world champion, would Hamilton back himself to beat Verstappen in equal machinery? I'm sure he would, in the same way that Verstappen would back himself to beat Hamilton or anyone else in equal machinery. That's how these top drivers work. But when you bring in somebody with that kind of caliber, whatever way round it is, you're effectively saying to your star man, to some degree, that we don't have full trust in you, possibly. Depends on your opinion, right? Because at Ferrari, that's kind of how it was with Leclerc and Hamilton, but it's not like there was a clear-cut number one, number two dynamic there at Ferrari. And okay, sure, Leclerc has been the stronger over the last few years. Sainz has still been very good. So bringing in Hamilton maybe doesn't mean what it would to Leclerc, what it potentially would mean at a different team. Whereas Hamilton, for years has been the number one driver. That's how it was installed. And it wasn't always, they could still fight on track and stuff with himself and Bottas. But when you've been in that position for many years, obviously Russell's come in and been very competitive, especially the most recent season in 24. If Toto was to be on the phone to Max all the time saying, oh, we want to bring him in, then, it shows to some degree, I think maybe to Hamilton, that the trust or the faith wasn't fully there. As it turned out, of course, Hamilton had decided to leave anyway, so frankly, it didn't matter much. But it's something interesting to think about anyway, and we hope that at some point Verstappen will get an incredibly competitive teammate. I think that would be fascinating for the sport, but it's not happening now, and it may not happen in the future. Maybe if he goes to Aston or even Mercedes, that's not an impossibility. There was also this, so Hamilton and Carlos Sainz were having a discussion, and I'm not going to be perfectly honest, I've not really watched any episodes of Drive to Survive ever. I watched a couple of the very first season. I think as someone who watches and follows Formula 1 very closely, I know that you guys would agree with me when you're like, they take things out of context a little bit, and the stories aren't really real all the time. And it's not always my cup of tea, but there has been some discussion that this season has more of that old school Drive to Survive behind the scenes content that fans really want to see, even fans who can accept, I guess, the fact that what they show is not actually what happens. I mean, there's been rumours that the episode of Drive to Survive that covers Spa has Russell winning the race, and then they just fail to mention that he got disqualified because they try to build up this story that, you know, Russell's taken over Hamilton at the team, Hamilton's going elsewhere, so who are they going to have as his replacement, this type of stuff at Mercedes. You know, this is how Drive to Survive does it sometimes, but if there are some interesting moments, we're going to talk about it. And Hamilton apparently had a conversation when he said, are you talking to Toto about getting my drive, right? We effectively swap drives. Sainz says, I haven't talked to Toto yet, which makes me feel like if he really had an interest, he would have already called me, which is interesting because we think that Mercedes and Sainz could have done a one-year deal, but they wanted to make sure that they could get Antonelli in. So, yeah, as Sainz says, you don't think Merc will win again? Do you think they are declining? And Hamilton says, no, I don't think so. He just wanted to go elsewhere. But to be fair, when he joins Ferrari, he made comments about, you know, leaving McLaren and, you know, basically similarities with what happened when he left McLaren and when he's now leaving Mercedes. But so far this season, at least based on the test, seems like Mercedes have produced a rather decent car. And to be fair, Sainz feels like he's in a decent car as well in the Williams. He did say though, Sainz publicly, he did a message to kind of say, look guys, don't get your hopes up. I'm not going to win the championship at Williams and I'm not going to be on the podium. I'm not going to be in the top 5. But, you know, who knows how competitive that Williams car will be. The thing is with the Williams, they are focusing massively on next year. So to be fair though, other teams in that kind of ballpark will be as well. So they could be clear-cut 5th best Williams. It's not impossible. Can they win? I mean, unlikely. I know that Lando Norris said and McLaren have kind of said, oh, you never know. Could be a 5th team this year, mixing it up right at the top. And Alonso made a pretty funny comment on this and says, look, Lando's only saying that now that he's got the best car. Back in the day, he used to say something not similar to that when he had the weaker car, and it was like, oh, Mercedes are always going to win and all this. So, yeah, a little bit of spice, I suppose, between those two guys. We'll see if they're beefing on track. Unlikely, because the Aston Martin is not looking especially good this year. But there's a feeling that maybe Williams could be a threat to right at the top of the field. It would be a fascinating story. I hope that it happens in upcoming seasons, but I think we have to keep our feet on the ground a little bit in terms of what we are expecting this year. Before we get to the Ferrari stuff, interesting couple of things on Red Bull. So, well, this is an interesting stat anyway. It's happened multiple times before, and who knows whether it'll happen again. But Newey is departing ways with Max Verstappen, and every time this has happened previously, when a driver has won championships in a Newey car, after his departure or after their departure or whatever has happened in time, they've never won a championship again. Now, one might argue Max is different gravy, and one might also argue that maybe he will join Newey at Aston Martin. Who knows? That's a possibility. But this current car, it's very difficult to say how good the RB21 actually is. Pierre Wachet's been talking a lot about it, of course. And I know that there's a lot of Red Bull fans, I see these in the comments increasingly now, that are saying, this guy Wachet, the technical director, he does talk a lot, right? Like, he talks a lot. Does he make the car better? Dunno, right? Like, since Newey's departure, this guy's in the spotlight, right? Because he's heading up the team, he's the technical director, but, you know, is he a fraud, right? That's what people are talking about. I see it in every comment section to some degree. But he does talk a lot, and it's interesting. I like hearing his perspective, and I'm sure he's an incredibly talented, competent engineer. But he's no Adrian Newey, I guess, is the realization maybe. We modified most of the stuff that is maybe not as visible as the older car, but concepts overall stay the same. Plenty of stuff though has changed underneath and inside the car, then in terms of cooling, suspension, aero package, everything has changed to achieve the characteristics that we like. But of course, they also said that they've not gone as far with their kind of resolutions as they were hoping to achieve, really. And he also was talking to Thomas Maher at Planet F1 and saying that they have rectified some of the issues. The car is definitely less peaky. They can derive more performance than they could last year, let's say, on a consistent basis. But it's maybe not resolved all of their issues, and you know, there's a discussion that we reevaluated all the concepts. Now, according to this discussion, the RB21 is roughly 3 to 4 tenths a lap faster than last year's car, which according to the upgrades that we're hearing about the Ferrari, about the McLaren, is probably, you know, it's okay. It's kind of where you want to be, probably on the lower bounds. You know, Red Bull might have hoped for a bit more. But if the car, in terms of its peak potential, is 3 to 4 tenths faster, and they can actually get to that potential more often, which they couldn't really with last year's car, despite it still being fast when they really did get it right, such as in Brazil, for example, even before Verstappen's masterclass on the Sunday, the same still applies, that maybe they can actually gain more than this in terms of lap time, because you might argue, well, last year at Abu Dhabi, the Red Bull was lacking 3 to 4 tenths to the McLaren and the Ferrari then. So if they've moved forward to where McLaren and Ferrari were last year, they're still behind. So a lot of it comes down to whether they can extract the performance in the car, I guess, and we'll see how about that. These are just some kind of comments in the article really on what he had to say to Thomas Maher and the Planet F1 guys about the setup of the car right now. But yeah, talking about more freedom in the setup possibilities. But I think one of the most concerning things is this: Washay not confident the correlation issues have been fully understood or solved, which of course is the discrepancy between what happens on the track and what the data says should happen back at the simulator and the wind tunnel. That was a problem for Red Bull last year, and he's saying we're not sure we solved it. And if he's not sure they solved it, you know, they've not solved it, I guess would be the conclusion to draw. But intrigued to your thoughts in a comment. Let's talk Ferrari though, because Red Bull, they said, Washay said, as I say, he's been talking to the media a lot. He said that as far as they believe Red Bull, they are behind McLaren and behind Ferrari. Now, everyone is behind McLaren. The rest of the field, it's very difficult to call as we currently understand it. But what about this Ferrari? Because there are rumours that Ferrari did some sandbagging during testing, and they were, let's just say, withholding the true performance of that machine. But on the other hand, Ferrari are still putting in a lot of simulator work to actually make this happen. So I thought this article was very interesting. Again, De Kessa and Rosario doing a killer job. I'll leave everything linked down below as always. But yeah, the car is new, and as it's described here, Leclerc has already been burned and was extremely cautious in his predictions. Hamilton didn't get his last race run in due to what we believe was a hydraulic issue that prevented them from pulling that off on the final day. And as the article describes, it would be wrong to say the SF-25 has completely convinced spectators and insiders. In Maranello, they are talking about settings that still need to be calibrated, and therefore there are still some doubts about the firepower of the SF-25. This, though, I thought was particularly interesting. Red Bull is a bit disappointed by its own tests and sees Ferrari as the closest force to McLaren, a sign, according to Washay, that the SF-25 has played hide and seek a bit more than others. The Constructors' title holders took a risk with the MCL39 to try and make the World Championship boring, but they say, we don't trust Ferrari at all. So it's quite interesting because both Red Bull and McLaren seem to be looking at Ferrari and saying, we don't think that's their true performance, because the car was fast on the Saturday at times, but it was inconsistent otherwise a lot of the time, getting the setup in the right place. The long runs weren't especially good, but there was a feeling that maybe Ferrari were running with higher, fuel loads and lower performance from the engine than some of the other teams were. So that's to consider. But it's interesting, right? I mean, McLaren saying we don't trust Ferrari, like we don't trust that they are where we think they are based on the numbers from the test, which would put them maybe second, maybe third, maybe fourth, but regardless, behind where McLaren are. McLaren aren't convinced that Ferrari have shown their true hand as yet. And also all of these teams, they have the GPS data to the hilt, right? They can look at the numbers, they can see maybe what the acceleration data looks like, and therefore maybe the way that the engine is being tuned and some of these other factors. But still, does it remind you a little bit maybe of what happens, let's just say, in 2022? Of course, there was a different time then, but at that time, Mercedes had just won everything for the previous 8 years, and they turned up to Bahrain and it was pretty rubbish, right? It wasn't looking good. But the other teams, understandably, were looking at the Mercedes at the time and saying, are we sure that they're actually not good? Or is this just for show, really? And actually, they are sandbagging effectively in 2022. Of course, it turned out they were actually not sandbagging and the car was just bad. But equally, the Ferrari, it's not like other teams, they've not seen Ferrari dominate for years, and therefore Ferrari finally produce a bad car and they say, oh, well, we still think they're hiding something. Ferrari have been competitive, but not like that competitive in terms of winning. They've been there 22, 24, like they've had their opportunities, but it's not been anything dominant, and they've won 0 championships in that time span. So, maybe there is more than meets the eye to the idea of other teams being scared than just the car isn't actually that good. So I'm just scrolling through some of the other details in the article. The interesting piece, I guess, is this. Leclerc and Hamilton are currently in Maranello for a 3-day simulator session based on a program aimed at taking stock of the situation in view of Australia. The two Ferrari drivers will have a rather busy week because in addition to the work in the factory, they will also have off-track work. They've got some, events they've got to do as well. The SF-25 will actually be seen in 2 weeks on a track quite different to Bahrain, of course, in Australia. The focus will be on putting the rear in the window without weakening the front, on a track that also offers technical ideas in terms of the tyres and any front graining. The aero setup will not see any upheavals, however. The new generation rear wing with a more pronounced spoon in the middle, as we can see there, is finally at the centre of a macro configuration that will often see it used on medium load tracks, which Australia often tends to be. So yeah, intrigued to your thoughts and a comment on this. McLaren and Red Bull think that Ferrari might have been sandbagging to some degree. Ferrari, though, are putting their drivers heavily in the simulator to effectively hash out any unknowns that there may currently be with their car. Both drivers apparently have mentioned that there's some mechanical challenge with getting the rear to properly follow the front, which sounds like a bit of an oversteery tendency. I guess you turn in the front grips up, and then maybe the rear of the car doesn't grip up as well, and it wants to slide out on you. Hamilton's dealt with that a lot over the last few years in the Mercedes, and he does seemingly feel much more comfortable in this year's car than last year's Mercedes, and that's good news for Hamilton. But is the car actually as fast as it needs to be? There's a question, because McLaren looked pretty indomitable during the long run data that we have from the weekends. So yeah, this is the SF-25. We'll see. I don't really know. I don't really know. Ferrari are saying, oh, the vibes are still good. Vasseur was talking about it. He actually said this. He was discussing actually when he came into the team and said that after losing in 2022, there was a real trauma within the team. I thought it was fascinating because, in many respects that is Ferrari. But basically when he came in for 23, the team was reeling off thinking they were going to win in 22. And then, of course, the title challenge collapsed. Bonotto famously said in Hungary, there's no reason why we can't win the remaining 10 races, of which, of course, they won 0, right? It was only Mercedes at Brazil, I think, that won anything from then on outwards apart from the Red Bull. And yeah, it was established quickly, as I knew how many people at Ferrari. 22 had been a great season in terms of results. But as he says here, we want to fight for both championships, as we know we have two drivers who can do both of them. And the mood in the team is very positive. We've got to keep pushing to be fully ready for the season opener. So yeah, talk about the team being positive. There's optimism in the team that they can resolve some of the issues. But I think issues there are. Like, it wasn't super smooth. They're not 100% sure that they've got everything right, which is probably expected, having taken substantial risk with changing the front suspension geometry for the upcoming season when none of the other top teams have done so, at least in terms of philosophy, between push rod to go to pull rod. McLaren have gone more extreme, but fundamentally their concept is roughly the same in that regard. So maybe it was inevitable that Ferrari would have some teething issues, but they will need to solve them and solve them fast, or maybe they're not as bad as we think, and McLaren and Red Bull are right that Ferrari are not to be trusted in terms of their current performance. Just one thing to close out the video with. I was talking Drive to Survive earlier. There's been like a lot of drama going on Twitter lately, and I'm excited to see how this goes really, especially if we do have a year where the McLaren is the quickest car by a margin, and it is a teammate battle for the World Championship, as it were. Because there's comments that during Drive to Survive, they present Piastri as, like, potentially a driver with greater talent than Lando, a man for the future, and that type of stuff. And I think Piastri's excellent. Do I think he's got greater potential than Norris? Not as far as I've seen. And, well, anyway, Lando fans, of course, are going to give their take on it and say 20-4, slower than his team, less points, less wins. It should be fewer points, fewer wins, fewer podiums, but whatever, won't say that too much. I know that I make those mistakes as well sometimes too. No pole positions, ice cold mentality, which is true. Tyre budget, probably stuck in traffic. So, whether you think this is fair or not, it's just indicative to me of what we are going to start to see, which is going to be, if the McLaren is particularly good, we're going to get that intra-team rivalry, that inter-team fan-base rivalry popping off. And of course, the opening round is in Australia. If the McLaren is the strongest car, that's a big talking point for Piastri, right? So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.